Now, as Kennedy struggled to get his civil rights legislation through Congress, where it basically just bogged down, he's in Dallas, and as we know the story, he is assassinated, leaving Vice President Lyndon Johnson to become president and really to continue JFK's legacy to the extent that it was a legacy at that point. Now, Johnson was a very unlikely person to be pushing for civil rights, as he was, a Southern Democrat and very much of that group that would have ordinarily been against what Kennedy was doing. He was seen as the hope to sort of be able to speak to that group and get it through, but it didn't. Now, with Kennedy being assassinated, it provided Johnson with an opportunity based on sort of the martyrdom of Kennedy to push it through, but it still wasn't that easy. So much like Lincoln did with the 13th Amendment, where he had to manipulate and in some cases threaten and coerce and persuade, Johnson has to do the same to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 actually passed. And there's no way to really overstate what this act did. This is the most significant piece of civil rights legislation ever passed in the United States. And it really had three parts. And I think the biggest part that people remember is prohibiting segregation in public accommodations. So stores, restaurants, hotels. So all of that going back to 55 with the Montgomery bus boycott, and 60 with the sit-ins, and 61 with the Freedom Rides, and then 63 with Birmingham. This is the culmination of all of that. Yet, even though it provided for desegregation and it actually barred discrimination in employment, and sort of cynically Congress threw in sex discrimination, thinking that no one would actually go for it at the time, but it still passed. It also increased the power of the government to file lawsuits on behalf of school integration. So at this point, it's 10 years after Brown versus Board, but with all deliberate speed is not really that speedy. And so at this point, Congress is going to create an enforcement mechanism, and unfortunately still doesn't necessarily go as fast as the Supreme Court would have wanted, or even Congress at this point would have wanted. But what's important to recognize is, much like the 14th Amendment during Reconstruction, which protected citizenship or gave African American citizenship, it didn't give suffrage. So much as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 goes a long way towards desegregation, it doesn't protect voting rights or doesn't guarantee voting rights. So the next chapter, the third chapter, is going to be much quicker in terms of sort of moving from civil rights to voting rights, but it's also going to be a struggle. Now, it's important to realize that Malcolm X opposes MLK. Now, they're both fighting for the same idea. They're fighting for African American rights. But as we sort of continue our story into Chapter 3, it's important to take a bit of a detour to talk about what Malcolm X who stood for and what he was. So Malcolm X at first represented or spoke for the Nation of Islam, which really was not that connected to Islam, but was more a black nationalist group. And as opposed to what MLK was talking about, there was an emphasis not only on black pride, but also on, we need to be independent of whites, and we need to be able to defend ourselves if we're attacked. And Malcolm X's rhetoric, as we heard in class, was much more incendiary. It didn't necessarily have the polish of Dr. King, and it certainly wasn't coming out of any sort of religious philosophy. But it spoke to a group that maybe didn't agree with what MLK was doing. Ultimately, Malcolm X, once he leaves the Nation of Islam, is killed by a Nation of Islam member who was upset that he had left the group, and Malcolm X had sort of talked ill of the group after he left. But it's important to realize that this voice that is a bit counter to what MLK is doing, which in some ways you see within SNCC, who's opposing him, at least in some ways, or at least disagrees with him in some ways, as we saw in the movie Selma for those who went. But this more militant rhetoric and approach is going to come back in the form of the Black Panthers in 1966. But as we return to the narrative of Chapter 3, we're going to look at moving from the Civil Rights Act to the Voting Rights Act. And one of the first places that those who are looking for voting rights go is to Mississippi. So much as the Civil Rights Act really revolved around first going to Alabama, particularly Birmingham, the same idea is going to be to go to Mississippi. Mississippi had the lowest rate of African Americans registered in the country at only about 7%. So you had hundreds of white and some northern black college students coming down to Mississippi in the summer of 1964, not only to register African Americans, but also to hold what are known as freedom schools to help those African Americans in Mississippi catch up over the summer from the inferior education that they were getting. Now, in many ways, this is an interesting movement between Jewish youth or Jewish young adults and African Americans, both of whom had been discriminated against in their history in the United States, and there had always been sort of a kinship between these particular groups. And unfortunately, the biggest tragedy that occurs, or the most noteworthy tragedy that occurs during Mississippi Freedom Summer, you have one college student as well as an African American core activist, and then Michael Schwerner, who was known as a core organizer. They go missing after an investigation of church bombings, and the Klan had bombed churches all the way across Mississippi. And they go missing. 6 weeks later, their bodies are found, and months later, the station wagon that they were driving in was found. Now, after many years of trials, it is determined that not only the police are involved, but at the same time, the Ku Klux Klan. And even though many people are accused of being involved in this, only a few are sent to prison, and at the most, anyone serves time is 6 years. We're going to move back to Alabama, specifically to Selma, where SCLC and King have basically been summoned to try to deal with African Americans continually being turned away when they're trying to register. Now, it's important to note that SNCC had actually been in Selma for a number of years already and really resented the fact that MLK and SCLC sort of showed up, in part because SNCC really had a grassroots effort to try to work from the bottom up, and they felt like King came in and was stealing all of the spotlight. Now, unfortunately, there is a death of an activist named Jimmy Lee Jackson, which really pushes this idea from just protesting in Selma, much like you would have seen perhaps in Birmingham. But Jimmy Lee Jackson's murder provided a catalyst to actually march from Selma to Montgomery, specifically to ask Alabama Governor George Wallace, remember him of the stand in the schoolhouse door, if he'd ordered the state troopers to murder Jimmy Lee Jackson. Now, of course, the march was not just about Jimmy Lee Jackson. It was about the overall, violation of constitutional rights in terms of not allowing African Americans to vote. And because of a number of events, King will not be able to attend that march. And the event proceeded without King. And as the protesters left Selma, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they encountered Alabama state troopers at the other end of the bridge who, in Bloody Sunday, not only attacked the protesters who were peacefully there with billy clubs and tear gas, but they violently chased them back across the bridge, all captured again on television. Now, hundreds of people from around the country sort of see what has happened in Selma and are going to be inspired to come to Selma, particularly members of the white clergy. So people arrive in Selma, and then on Turnaround Tuesday, which is just 2 days after Bloody Sunday, there's going to be another attempt to march. King will be there for that one, and as they cross the bridge, way more protesters than there was before. King famously kneels, and everyone else kneels as well. King did this because there was a court order that said that the march could not actually go into a different county. So even though most of the protesters didn't know this would happen, he stopped the march, before anyone could actually ever leave Selma. And many people were upset because they felt like, why did I come all the way here to be part of something that King wasn't actually going to fulfill? But what King was really trying to do was buy time. And 2 weeks later, he's going to actually lead a third march, this time with federal protection provided by LBJ. And they will make that 4-day march all the way to Montgomery. Now, over the course of these events that are happening in Selma, the 3 different marches, again, not only the country but the world seems to be fixated on just how bad the situation is. And that allows LBJ to push forth the Voting Rights Act of 1965, also known as the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And what this is going to do is it's going to provide federal protection to blacks attempting to exercise their right to vote, which is interesting because basically 100 years ago, in the 14th Amendment, during Radical Reconstruction, as the military is actually there and divided up the South into 5 different districts, one of those tenets of that was to provide federal protection. Now, of course, in 1877, with Reconstruction over and Jim Crow being the law of the land, clearly people were back to being restricted from actually exercising that right to vote. Now we move on to chapter 4, which in many ways is the unfinished chapter. And by unfinished, I mean that still really being dealt with today. Now, when you think about education, you think about desegregation, you think about voting rights, they seem to have sort of very clear goals. The economic rights was much harder to sort of quantify and understand. And this is a movement that is going to actually not involve the South as much. It's going to involve the North and the West. So the movement moves from one region of the country to different regions. And their effort is going to be to eliminate de facto segregation, which is different than Jim Crow. Jim Crow was de jure segregation, which means by law. De facto means by custom and practice. And the custom and practice that civil rights activists were really focusing on were housing and job discrimination, because people thought that together, if people are being limited in where they can live and the kind of loans that they can get, and they're being discriminated against in the workforce, it just creates and perpetuates this cycle of poverty that African Americans have been dealing with for so long. Now, this frustration over the lack of economic opportunity really is demonstrated by famous riots that occur not only in Watts in 1965, where essentially miles of this particularly African American area goes up in flames as people are protesting mistreatment by the police. You also see this in Detroit in 1967. So again, what we're noticing here is it's not the South. We've got the East and the West literally burning. And after all this, LBJ is trying to figure out how is it that there's such urban unrest. And he actually gets a commission together, and they look at the situation, and not surprisingly, they look and they say, this is all because of a lack of economic opportunity. And so they make a number of recommendations. These are not laws, but they're basically pointing out what needs to be done. New jobs. You want better housing. You want to break up this racial segregation. And also, at the end of the day, since many of these events seem to be caused by perceived police brutality, you need to hire more diverse, that means actually minorities, and more sensitive police officers. Now, the struggles to end de facto segregation can be most seen in MLK coming to Chicago. The hope by many people is that he'd had so much success with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that this would be the natural sort of extension of it, and that he could draw attention to the housing and employment discrimination. And he came and he lived in Chicago for 8 months, and he received really tough treatment. And his main discovery was that northern whites seemed to support him when he was in the South, but when they actually saw him in the North, they were far less willing to let him do what he was trying to do, and they actually stood in the way.